Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Welcome to Window on the West, where we explore all the ages of Tolkien's Middle-earth, with your hosts, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Welcome to Window on the West. Thanks for joining us again this week. My name is Jonathan Watson from theonering.com, and I'm here along with Michael Grumbine and
Howdy.
Dan Coates.
Hey.
We're continuing our journey through the Silmarillion. Today we're starting on the Quenta Silmarillion, actually, and with Chapter 1 of the Beginning of Days. But before we get started, hi guys, it's nice to see you. We actually had a 1-week break because of work and other things. We do have lives that are outside of anything Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, etc.
They're not much, but there are lives. So
They're our lives, and they're important to us. At least I'm important to me. You guys can move along however you want. Yeah. So
I'll take the blame. It was my fault for missing last week.
That's okay. Nobody will know. We're trying to get a few ahead. So shh.
That's right. Cut this out.
Let's go on. Let's get started. And one of the things we like to do is, for at least we like to do for the second time, little section we're calling
All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter,
where a couple of us have to identify a Tolkien quote. And this week, Michael is in charge of screwing us over with 2 incorrect quotes and 1 correct one.
So this will be Jonathan's first time at quotes.
Yeah, this is really nerve-wracking.
I did 4 quotes, so
I feel like I have
3 incorrect and 1 correct. So I picked themes, and this week's theme is war. So here's 4 quotes, one of which is from Tolkien, and the other 3 of which are not, about war. So quote number 1. Let's see how good Jonathan is for the first time, and Dan is for the second time. Dan got it and won last time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, quote number 1. The war is not over, and the one that is has been largely lost. But it is, of course, wrong to fall into such a mood, for wars are always lost, and war always goes on. So that's quote number 1. Quote number 2. My memories of the last war haunted my dreams for years. Military service, to be plain, includes the threat of every temporal evil, pain and death, isolation from those we love, toil under arbitrary masters, hunger, thirst, and exposure. Quote number 3. In war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners, but all are losers. And quote number 4. The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him.
I'm not detecting the prose of Tolkien in any of these right now.
Which is good, because that's why I chose
I am actually
a theme that's pretty strong.
Pretty certain I know which one is right.
So then
I feel like I'm 90% certain.
We're going to start with Dan then.
All right.
I'm going to go ahead and take a stab at it. I'm going to say that the second quote is Tolkien.
Okay, so the second quote is, my memories of the last war haunted my dreams for years. Military service be plain.
I'm gonna go with that one, just because it seems like it's talking about his autobiography there.
Okay. All right. And Jonathan?
So on the One Ring's Twitter account, which is @Torc, TORC, we do quote posts every day.
Yeah, I knew this was going to provide you with an advantage.
This is not fair.
And I'm pretty sure that one of them was the last one. The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. I'm pretty sure.
Excellent. I win. All right.
You do.
So the answer is neither number 2 nor number 4.
Wow.
So number 2, chosen by Mr. Coates, was
is it
C.S.
the first
Lewis
one then?
quote. Yes, it is the first one.
Okay, that was so the last quote is really, so I was wrong. My 10% went out. The last quote is really what is a quote from Aragorn, right? Or is it Gandalf?
Well, this is why I picked it. So the last quote is actually a G.K. Chesterton quote.
Is it Chesterton?
And you see,
dang it!
And you see in that quote almost exactly what.
See, maybe I read it in here the other day. Gosh, dang it!
So
Screwing me up.
it is, in fact, the same exact theme as my favorite quote from Faramir in the Two Towers, and so it is. It's along that same theme. But I was shocked to find out, because I had heard that quote was from Tolkien, and it is not. It is from Chesterton.
Huh. Well, you win. Dang it.
So,
well, which one is it now?
It's the first one.
So the first one, the war is not over, and the one that is has largely been lost. But it is, of course, wrong to fall into such a mood, for wars are always lost, and war always goes on. I think you can catch some hints of that in the mood of the Lord of the Rings itself, where there's and also the Silmarillion, where
sure in the Silmarillion,
the stories are of unending wars, essentially, as we're going to find out today. Right. And then the third quote, which neither of you chose, is from just from like
it's okay.
The failed English Prime Minister who kept England out of World War II for too long until Poland was taken.
Peace in Our Time.
Yes,
Neville Chamberlain.
Neville Chamberlain. Thank you.
Neville Chamberlain. There you go.
Cool. Well, good job. I was right after it went down to 3. After I wasn't able to use my lifeline. I guess.
That was a tough one.
Right.
That was really tough.
Good job.
Good.
Dan,
all right.
Maybe Dan next week, if you have the time, you can screw me and Michael over then, and
I'll find something.
Figure it out.
Excellent.
All right, so let's get into of the beginning of days, and we like to start with
Dan's Big Thought.
Well, it's like I'm the newbie here, right? I'm reading this for the first time. We're now fully into new material for me. I think I read the Aina Lindale a long time ago. This is fully fresh, fully new. My big thought, my reaction to this, reading it for the first time, is that you really get a sense that Middle Earth is the battleground. It is the place where the fight, the war is going to take place. It's the stage for everything that happened in the song, I think. So you have the two lights, and then Melkor comes. It's a lot of themes of light versus darkness. You have the two lights that are there, and Melkor comes, and he's kind of weaved clouds of darkness around him to come and destroy those lights and destroy everything that the Valar were creating in Middle Earth. Then they flee, and then now they're set up in Valinor, and they make two new lights that are made out of trees. So you have like this constant light versus dark warfare going on. And so there's that going on. And there's also a handoff that the Valar are going to have the children of Ilúvatar kind of come and take over that war against evil. So I thought that was the main thing I took away from this chapter.
It's like it's setting the stage for everything to come. Things are created, and Melkor casts them down in every possible way that he can, and he destroys things.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Right. In that very first part, the thing that struck me this time, myself, which I hadn't caught before, which was awesome, was the quote about before Melkor comes, when Yavanna has these seeds that she planted that she then burst into bloom, and there's this massive feast, and it says, and this is the feast at which Melkor takes advantage and goes and destroys the lights while the Valar are having a great time. But the quote that I love was, "And there upon the Isle of Almer in the great lake was the first dwelling of the Valar when all things were young, and new made green was yet a marvel in the eyes of the maker, and they were long content." So the color green hadn't existed until the growing things, and they were just they marveled at it, and they were content just at the. I mean, obviously, the color green can't be separated from the life of the growing things themselves. So
yeah.
So there's a marvel there, but that whole aspect is of the Valar's fascination with the creation of a color itself is awesome. I loved it.
I like that. It's interesting to think. A couple things about that is not only was the new made green, right? So the one thing that struck me about this is that you forget that their first, the first thing they built, the first new thing they built was essentially the Great Lake. That if you use the Atlas of Middle Earth, that has a great illustration. I don't know if you guys took a look at it, but the
Yep.
lake, which has the Isle of, is it Almarin? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Yes, the Isle of
Almarin, yes.
Almarin in the Great Lake, and then to the north and the south are set the two great towers with the lights, two great posts, right? Um, and it's all symmetrical. Yeah, there you go. Dan's showing it right here on video. It's all symmetrical, and when Melkor comes in, he destroys it, and the symmetry is gone. Right? I mean, there's some symmetry, but there is like he creates. He comes in. He just casts them down. It creates the Great Lakes. It creates the oceans, essentially the first oceans, and this is before even it's remade again. That time period too is so much longer than we understand in here, because Tolkien was telling it. I was going into more research this time because we're doing it slower, and I'm not reading through it or listening to it as quickly as we would normally. And so I was like, okay, well, how long is this period of the lamps, the great post, the great lamps, right? And based on his notes, and he kind of changed it back and forth. The general idea is around 15,000 years of our years is how long those lamps were up, which is like 4 paragraphs here. And you wonder, what was he thinking about all those things that were going on then? And all we got were these 4 paragraphs, and it feels like we missed so much of it. But that was what stuck out to me this time, is that the time frame of just the lamps, and we get so little of the lamps, and what the Valar were doing, and what they were, how they were going about building, and the time period, the 15,000 years. Of course, they have Valian years, which I don't think we have to get into, and that is a long time, though, because all we get in the Third Age is a few thousand years.
Right. And I suppose because the focal point of Ilúvatar's creation is his children within Arda, then that's probably, at least you could say, that's one of the reasons why not much time is given to the time before that, and then everything really focuses on them. It's interesting. It was interesting to me that there's kind of 2 battles in this chapter. The first is at the very beginning of the first paragraph, right? And we get a different account of Tulkas in this regard. We get the fact that he's the last one to come into Arda. Mm-hmm. And so there was no Tulkas at first with the other Valar, and then he came in and sort of single-handedly drove Melkor out, and Melkor broods about that, and hates Tulkas in a special way. So,
he's like the Rowdy Roddy Piper to Hulk Hogan. Or maybe the other way around. The Hulk Hogan to the Rowdy Roddy Piper. Yeah. Am I dating myself really badly right now?
And that takes place while everything's being formed, right? There's no beast, there's no lights. It's just like, it's kind of like the forming of the earth by the Valar, and this war breaks out, and Tulkas shows up and drives Melkor away. And then Melkor, when he's driven away, then they start going back to building and making the world. Right. And then they set up the 2 lights, and then Melkor comes back again. So that's the second battle that we see.
Correct. And he destroys the lamps. So they set up the 2 lamps on pillars. He destroys that. Yeah. And then they drive him off again, but they cannot finish the job. He hides in a Tumno because this was interesting.
That's his stronghold in the north behind the Iron Mountains. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah, so he actually raises up these mountains and is able to hide from the sight of the Valar, basically.
Well, and
it says, in the confusion and the darkness, Melkor escaped, though fear fell on him, for above the roaring of the seas he heard the voice of Manwë and mighty wind, and the earth trembled beneath the feet of Tulkas. But he came to a Tumno ere Tulkas could overtake him, and there he lay hid.
But it's that next sentence that was interesting. And the Valar could not at that time overcome him, for the greater part of their strength was needed to restrain the tumults of the earth and to save from ruin all that could be saved of their labor. So you get this picture of them. They're just straining to keep everything, like keep the world together, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they can't actually finish the job of defeating him utterly, and so he hides in a Tumno. And then what they do is interesting, because at that point they raise the wall, the Pelori, this massive mountain wall that is the largest that has ever been raised, as a kind of barrier, basically, between Melkor and what they're going to focus on. And what they're going to focus on is Valinor, which is a portion of the land of Aman in the west. So they're in this land of Aman, and there's this massive wall of mountain, the Pelori, and then behind that wall is this paradise, essentially, that they build, protected from any further incursions by Melkor, apparently.
Yeah, it's kind of like, okay, version 2, we understand, like, it's not easy. So now we've got to put in some safeguards.
And so then they bring into being the trees, and the trees. It's so cool how the light from the trees is this physical thing. It like drops like the dew, and it has weight, and it moves around. It's not the way light is now. So it says there's the light from Telperion, which is the tree, with dark leaves that emits silver light. Laurelin.
Yes.
So one's gold and one's silver.
Right. And then he goes into some detail about how they shine and wax and wane in their light, almost like day and night, where Telperion's light is softer. At least that's the implication from what I could pick up. But there's golden light and silver light, and then that's the counting of the years begins at that point. The counting of days and hours and years begins at that point.
Yeah, like here's sort of that. It's that line at the end of, like, I don't know, the third or fourth section of this chapter, where he writes, "But the light that was spilled from the trees endured long ere it was taken up into the airs or sank down into the earth." It's almost like mist, right? It's not. There's, like you said, there's more density to it. It's not just photons bouncing around. There's actually some sort of heft to it. And he writes, "And the dews of Telperion and the rain that fell from Laurelin, Varda hoarded in great vats like shining lakes that were to all the land of the Valar, as well as of water and of light. Thus began the days of the bliss of Valinor. And thus began also the count of time. And thus began also the light," right? The light, which is the Silmarillion, because that's what's important. The Silmarils contain the light of Telperion, right? Yes.
I think is it both? Is it just Telperion, or
Gosh,
is it both of them?
this is why we're rereading it.
Yeah, and we haven't actually got to that part, I think, yet.
These are those little things that like seem so important now, but when you read through it a couple of times, you can't remember. But it struck me, right? It's magical in a way, right? How do you contain the light of something in a gem? And I think we'll get into it. That's a longer discussion that we can have. But that's because, like you said, I think it's more physical than it is just a wavelength.
Yeah, the light almost seems liquid, like you were saying, a mist. Yeah, it all, like you can contain it in a vessel or a glass. We see that in the Lord of the Rings, right? With the phial of Galadriel, she has the water,
that's a good point,
which has the light of the star of Eärendil in it. So there's a sense in which there are almost like greater lights and lesser lights, and you can contain light, or at least the elves and the Valar can, like all kind of water, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's also in this chapter that we get a lot of discussion about a particular Valar, namely, Aulē is the one that's more interesting to me.
And why is that? Why do you like Aulē?
Well, because he's the builder of things, or he's the artisan, I guess maybe is the best way to put it, or he's because and we'll get to this. Aulē, I think you might know this, Dan, but he has much to do with the dwarves, but he's also the Noldor are his favorite. The elves, the Noldor, Fëanor, those guys, right? The ones who I don't know what the craftsmen of the elves, maybe. I don't know what's the best way to put that, right? They are his favorite, and so there's this tug between the two of them. But the one Valar speaks for both of them in a way, and I like that sort of push and pull, because he's a craftsman and he loved the people who were craftsmen, but he also had essentially created these other people who are also craftsmen, and yet those two can't get along. The one Valar that is representative of both the Noldor and the dwarves, essentially the Noldor and the dwarves just can't get along, and we'll be fighting, and yet the Valar that they love. So
this is a really interesting theme that we're going to talk about over and over again. So we don't have to delve too deeply into it now, but building on what you're saying there, Jonathan, there's a tension for Tolkien in the exposition of craft itself. So if you think about it, Aulē himself is in tension with Melkor. They both in fact have skill at craft and in the making of things. And we were told that in the previous chapter that Melkor and Aulē were very similar to each other in that regard. Now Melkor quickly degenerated, and he can only mimic and then destroy and mimic then ultimately. Mm-hmm. But in his non-fallen form, that was that he and Aulē were tremendously similar in terms of the way what they looked at the world and the desire for the building of their own things. And we'll find out in later chapters, but you just mentioned the crafting of the making of the dwarves, and that whole chapter is very interesting because it's almost like Aulē almost makes a grave mistake with regard to that. So there's this inherent danger in craft. We see that, of course, very powerfully in the whole of this book, the Silmarillion, like the craft of Fëanor, who is the greatest craftsman of all the children of Ilúvatar, becomes a tragedy for his people. So there's a fascinating juxtaposition and tension between the ability to subcreate, to craft things from the material around, and the danger that brings.
It would be curious to also look at Tolkien's other thoughts about subcreation. And I can't remember which essays it's from particularly. Is it on Fairy Stories where he talks about it? But where he he discusses more about his thoughts of subcreation and bringing that into the context of how he constructed his world here and the dangers, like you were saying, the dangers and glory and beauty of subcreation, in a sense. And can you take it too far?
So at this point, all of the light in all of the world is in Valinor, the Blessed Realm, and right now over Middle Earth, it's twilight, right? It's just stars that Varda put up there.
Right, less than twilight, right? It's just darkness with the stars.
Yeah. So one thing I found interesting a little bit later is that Yavanna is unwilling to forsake the outer lands. It seems like all the Valar are kind of holed up in Valinor, and they're okay with hanging out there, but some of them are still looking east to the Middle Earth that they left behind. And so Yavanna, all the things that grow being dear to her, and she mourns for the works that she had begun in Middle Earth, but Melkor had marred. And then we also read about Orome being a tamer of beasts who would ride through the unlit forest as a mighty hunter. So he's coming to kill all of Melkor's monsters in this unlit forest. And Yavanna keeps looking back there to the things that grew there. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that they still have an eye toward that, and it seems like they have an eye toward that with the thought in the back of their mind that the children of Ilúvatar are coming, and they need to make sure that Middle Earth is ready for them.
Like you said in the beginning, it's another instance of them fighting against the darkness almost.
Yeah,
they're going into the darkness to beat it back a little bit in the ways that they can.
Yeah,
right. But only two of them, right?
Only
Yavanna
two of them.
And Orome.
Right.
And the others, and maybe this is a point which we can bring up later as well. But did the Valar err in that regard? They do, as you said, Dan. They do seem to pull themselves back into this sort of retreat into the thing that they know they can protect. They erect this unbelievably massive wall of mountains, and they build this paradise that they know they can protect from Melkor, and they leave the rest of the world in darkness.
And then there's also Ulmo, where it says that
you're right.
He's still sending his life-giving water to Middle Earth. That he's
right,
and he never hangs out in Valinor either. He only hangs out. He's kind of like Aquaman or whatever. He's always in the water.
Poseidon maybe is a better.
He's Poseidon.
We can go Poseidon instead of Jason Momoa, but that's
all right. But he's another Valar that doesn't decide to just hang out where it's safe.
And that like if I can bring up this, my favorite quote from this chapter, one of the things I always look at, I think each week, is like, what is the quote that stuck out to me? Is where he writes about Ulmo, and he says, "In the deep places, he gives thought to music great and terrible, and the echo of that music runs through all the veins of the world, in sorrow and in joy. For if joyful is the fountain that rises in the sun, its springs are in the wells of sorrow, unfathomed at the foundations of the earth." And it's one of those pieces of prose that says so much more than just the words, because when you think about, joy, like joy here for him, like joy in the fountains, can only be had if there are wells of sorrow, the destruction of Middle Earth. And in the same way, sort of like, I don't know, maybe too much bringing this into a personal way, but you can't experience true joy unless there's like real sorrow that it's born out of, because you don't know what it is. It's kind of like teaching kids, right? You don't teach kids to be happy kids. You teach them to be happy adults, and so they go through some sorrow in their youth, but they know what joy truly is if they're raised in that way, in those deep wells. I love that quote. There's depth to it, and it's said in such a concisely beautiful way. Yeah,
it is, and it taps into that mystery of the oceans, which Tolkien is always coming back to from time to time, where there's something powerful and mysterious and dangerous and life-giving about the oceans, and fascinating to the peoples of Middle Earth.
Yeah, because again, as I so pointedly learned, that the water is the echo of the music of the Ainur, essentially. And it says that here, in the deep places, he gives thought to music great and terrible, and the echo of that music runs through all the veins of the world. And so the sound, or the music of creation, almost is the water running through the veins of the world. Love that vision. Love that what it shows in my head. Yeah.
Dan, did you have any other favorite quotes or things that popped out at you besides the Yavanna and Orome and Ulmo being the only ones to tend to the darkness of Middle Earth?
Yeah. Just the other side of that, I guess, or just continuing on from that in the next paragraph, Tolkien makes a point of talking about the children of Ilúvatar being elves and men, and how the Valar are kind of handing off the fight to them in a sense. And it says that the Valar are to these kindred rather than elders, and they're chieftains rather than their masters. So it's just kind of like this idea that like the Valar they're not Ilúvatar. They're not. I guess in a sense they're not big G God to the children of Ilúvatar. They're just kind of advisors, or they're kind of they're kindred, I guess, rather than elders, is how Tolkien puts it. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, don't we see that too in the echo of the wizards? So the sentence after what you were saying, Dan, is, and if ever in their dealings with elves and men, the Ainur, and that would include both Valar and Maiar, the Ainur have endeavored to force them when they would not be guided. Seldom has this turned to good, howsoever good the intent. Yeah. So you see, even with the wizards, when the wizards, Maiar, come among the men and elves in Middle Earth, the ones that are successful are the ones that attempt to guide but don't force. And then once they turn to force, like Saruman, it doesn't end well.
Yeah.
Whereas Gandalf is the example of the one who it does end well, because he's a continual guide. Radagast feels to me like almost a wizard that was sort of bowed out from the guidance of the children of Ilúvatar, to care for the creatures. And so he kind of almost fit into neither category there. But that passage that you quoted is really the beginning of the end of the last page of this chapter, and it is, in my mind, the most fascinating section of this chapter because it talks about the kind of things that are a mystery even to the Valar, and specifically it's speaking about the differences between elves and men, or Quendi and Atani. I always forget that the men have a name too.
The Atani, right? Yeah,
Atani, right? So, and specifically, it comes down to, it's like this interlude where Melkor has wrought this destruction, and this is my commentary, so I'm willing to be wrong on this, but my commentary is Melkor wreaks this destruction. Melkor tries to wreak destruction. He starts to succeed at the very first paragraph of this chapter. Then Tulkas comes in and drives them off. Then the Valar make this paradise across the earth. Melkor comes and ruins it again with the lamps and destroys most of it. So the Valar retreat, and they build a small paradise in the west, and the rest of the earth is in darkness. And then we have this interlude where it's like, meanwhile, back with Ilúvatar. And so we have Ilúvatar sitting there, and it says literally, he sat alone in thought. And he spoke, and he said, "Behold, I love the earth, which shall be a mansion for the Quendi and the Atani. But the Quendi shall be the fairest of all earthly creatures." And he goes on to talk about the characteristics of them. So they're immortal, but they have the greater bliss, he says. But he gives to the Atani a new gift. So there's this fascinating passage that he says about the differences between men and elves, which is not the usual one that people focus on. Usually people focus on the fact that elves can't die, for example, except by violence or when they tire of life. But in the fact that they're physically and in many other ways superior to men. But it says, but they should have a virtue to shape their life. This is the they being the Atani, the men. So the men should have a virtue to shape their life amid the powers and chances of the world, beyond the music of the Ainur, which is as fate to all things else. And of their operation, everything should be in form indeed completed in the world, fulfilled unto the last and smallest. So Ilúvatar is saying, like, the music of the Ainur is like fate to everyone else, including the elves. So the elves are bound with it to the world, and they have a fate that's tied to the world. But men have this gift, which is beyond an ability to shape, he says, to shape their life amid the powers and chances of the world. And then the second gift he gives them is the gift of death, which is a very interesting one, and one that's a mystery to the Ainur. And so one of the last sentences, it says, "But the sons of men die indeed and leave the world. Therefore they are called the guests or strangers. Death is their fate, the gift of Ilúvatar, which as time wears, even the powers shall envy." So a fascinating take on death there, right? Which is that it's not just a bad thing. It's actually a gift from Ilúvatar, and they leave the circles of the world. The elves are bound to the world. Even when they die, if they're killed or weary of life, they go to the halls of Mandos, and then they live with the Valar there, or at least some of the Valar. And then
the Valar themselves, they're bound to being part of the earth too, right?
Well, yes, and not by nature. By nature, they're outside the world, but they've chosen to participate in the music, to craft the world and then guide it. So they are indeed part of the circles of the world. They're not going to end when the circles of the world end. But there's this very cool, the very last sentence says, "Yet of old the Valar declared to the elves in Valinor that men shall join in the second music of the Ainur, whereas Ilúvatar has not revealed what he purposes for the elves after the world's end, and Melkor has not discovered it." So the men actually
go men.
Yeah, they have this this purpose, which is on the level even of the Ainur, where they're going to be part of the music, and we don't even know if the elves are. So it's just really fascinating. It's not your usual take on the comparison between men and elves.
You know what I like it that it does beyond the mystery that is to us, and I'd really love to, like, there's so much depth to this that I would have loved to ask Tolkien what was going through your head as you thought about like the differences between elves and men and the Ainur, and why men, like why was this important to you? We can make guesses, but in all my reading, I don't think we know necessarily. Perhaps it's his experience with death in World War One, or with his parents, but the idea that death is a gift is very comforting, and I think that perhaps that plays a bigger part in it to him.
Right, and there's another passage in which not in this chapter, but and I can't even remember now. The problem with reading all the things like the unfinished tales and such is that I can rarely remember where I read it. But there's another place in which the Ainur suspect that the souls of men, when they leave the circles of the world, actually join Ilúvatar. So they've gone to Ilúvatar, whereas everyone else is here on Earth.
Yeah, I feel like that's in the Silmarillion. Again, we'll find out, I guess.
Yeah.
It does hit back on one of the themes we've touched on before on previous chapters of towards the end, where it says But Iluvatar knew that men, being set amid the turmoils of the powers of the world, would stray often and would not use their gifts in harmony. And he said, "These two in their time shall find that all they do redounds at the end only to the glory of my work." So just that good triumphing over evil, and even evil being used for good in the end.
Yeah.
I love
That's
that.
very provocative, isn't
that.
it? Because there's only one other being that Iluvatar said that to, and that's Melkor.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where where the final quote of that paragraph says, "For it seems to the elves that men resemble Melkor most of all the Ainur, although Melkor has ever feared and hated them, even those that served him." So the mystery of men, and he doesn't understand because he doesn't know where they are, what is at the end of this here, at the end of this chapter, right? That like he hates men, but yet to elves, men resemble Melkor the most, but yet he fears them. It's such an interesting distinction between the two, or a contrast.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah. Wow, short chapter, but a lot to dive into. But before we jump into the next one, I do like to do the if you like Tolkien section here. So
If you like Tolkien,
one of the things that I have is I got this, gosh, I think it was after The Return of the King came out. It might be published before that, I'm not sure. It's called the Lord of the Rings Sketchbook.
Nice.
Am I getting that right there?
Yep.
And what it is it's actually Alan Lee's sketches, not for the films. These were done before the films. This was for I think it was a centenary, on the centenary edition of The Lord of the Rings, 100 years after Tolkien was born, which had watercolor paintings and other works. And these were the sketches he provided to the Tolkien estate to get their permission, essentially, to say, I'm good enough to do that. And so he goes through all the sketches. And so even here, right, with the Argonath that we see, like this is his original sketch before you saw the films from Peter Jackson. And it's amazing how much his vision became Peter Jackson's. And his artwork, and Ted Nasmith and John Howe are always my favorites before the films came out. And I love seeing this vision that is filmless and is just black and white sketches, because it sort of sketches out a vision for it without it becoming your vision for it. And you know, I talked earlier about how what I don't like about the films is that once you see them, it's hard to imagine Frodo looking different, or Aragorn looking different, or even acting different in certain ways. And this here provides a little bit more of that glimpse into somebody else's vision that isn't a moving picture on a big screen with loud sounds and a soundtrack. So yeah, Lord of the Rings Sketchbook by Alan Lee, really good. It's still available on Amazon. I'll put a link in the show notes. But yeah, it's still available. Cool. It's like $24. It's published 2005, according to this, I think. But you can still get it. So I recommend it. It's pretty cool.
It's great that you showed a picture of the Argonath when you were in your example there, Jonathan, because we just read that. I just read Lord of the Rings, that section when they're passing it to my young sons.
Yeah.
And they wanted, so I showed them a picture from the only one I knew of. I didn't know of this thing from the movies, just so they could see a still shot of the Argonath. And they immediately caught like what should have been obvious, which Alan Lee, they don't have axes. They're supposed to have axes. They're very specifically, they both hold axes. And in the movie, I mean, it's CGI. So how hard would it have been?
That was a huge discussion point in our forums back when before the Two Towers came out and those pictures came out. I mean, I love the vision, right? It's actually the poster I have right there of the Argonath, because like the enormity of those statues is incredible. Like that's a vision in the films that resembled this and that I really loved.
I love the majesty of it too. I agree.
Yeah. But why not just axes? I guess because swords are cooler and they cut things more easily. I don't know. I have no idea. Well, you know, because Aragorn had a sword and they wanted to show it was Aragorn with the sword, and he was
Aragorn's
right.
Aragorn's ancestors.
But it could have been axes. Come on, like how big of a deal? Of course, they would say how big of a deal. In any case, respect the lore.
Respect the written word.
Yes, right. All right, guys. Well, I think we're good. This maybe went a little bit longer than usual. So thanks for listening, everybody. What is it next week? We're going into
Aulē and Yavanna.
Of Aulē and Yavanna and the coming of the elves. So those two short chapters. So thanks for listening. And the usual, make sure you subscribe, leave a review. We have these on YouTube too. And follow us on Twitter. It's under the Torque username, TORC. We'll post there when things go up and some clips and things like that, hopefully. And every day we have a quote of the day on Twitter, and we have actually artwork of the day, professional art of the day. So not just like fan art, but actually like John Howe, Alan Lee, Ted Nasmith, some of those big artists, and some of Tolkien's original we post every day there too. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye all.
We'll see you.
Michael, Dan, and Jonathan want to thank you, the listener, for joining us. Visit us at theonering.com, your source for everything Tolkien, where you can comment on this episode and join the conversation. This is Austin Robertson, bidding you farewell. May the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.